In the name of Allah, the most bounteous and the most merciful, I welcome all of you to Islamic readings. Assalamu alaikum. May peace, mercy and blessings of Allah be upon all of you. Today my topic is Islam and science. Let me define you that what is science. Science is an English word and the root word of science is scientia and it is a Greek word. Now let us discuss about science. Science refers to debate, to search, to research, to observe, to find, to define, to move, to meet, to wrangle, to discuss. Now it is clear that what is the meaning of word science. Now let us discuss about the books which are talking science or not. No one scripture could be put into the test of time beside the Quran. For anyone book to claim that it is revealed from Almighty Allah, then it would be proved by the scientific fact. Nowhere Old Testament talks about science, nowhere Bhagavad Gita talks about science, nowhere New Testament talks about science, nowhere Sanskrit talks about science, nowhere Atharvaved talks about science, nowhere Bible talks about science. But the Quran had talks about science, which we presently have come to know. And the reality is only given by Allah. In Surah Anbiya, chapter number 21, verse number 30 and 33. أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَّا وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ أَفَلَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. Which means, have not the disbelievers seen that the earth and heavens were joined altogetherly, and we parted them, and then we parted them, and we have made every living thing from the water. Which means that we have aforetime ago the sun, the moon, the skies, the planets, the stars, and the other things were joined altogetherly, were merged altogetherly. Then we parted them. Then suddenly a bomb blast. Then they take their own places, and now they are traveling on their own orbits. Furtherly, it is mentioned in Surah in verse number 33. وَهُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ اللَّيْلَ وَالنَّهَارَ وَالشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ كُلٌّ فِي فَلْكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ. Which means it is Allah which has created the day and the night, the moon and the sun, and each of them is traveling on their own orbits. I have already tell you that when a bomb blasts, then they take their own places, and now they are traveling on their own orbits. Now let us discuss about the shape of earth. It is mentioned in Quran in Surah Naziyat chapter number 79 verse number 30 and 32. Wal arda ba'da zalika dahaha, which means we have separated the earth as an egg shaped, and furtherly it is mentioned in verse number 32. Wal jibal arsaha, we have fixed the mountains firmly. It means that the earth is an egg shaped, but we believe that the earth is an circle shaped, but Quran had talks that the earth is an egg shaped, and at the little part of the earth there are fixed mountain to balance the earth. Now it is clear that the Quran is not following the science but the science. And if we ask to anyone of the religious scripture about science, about the solar system, each of them is like a silent mobile phone. Now let us discuss about the seas. It is mentioned in Surah Rahman, chapter number 55, verse number 19 and 20. Marajul Bahrain Yaltakiyan, he had let loose the two seas meeting together. Furtherly, it is mentioned in verse number 20. Bainahuma barazqul la yabghiyan, and between them is a barrier, none of them can encroach. Here we are being guided by Quran that there are two seas. One part is salty and one is sweetly. And there is a barrier, none of them can encroach and none of them can mix but Allah. Now we should talk about the commandment of Allah. It is mentioned in Quran in Surah Rahman chapter number 55. It is mentioned in verse number 13. It is mentioned in verse number 16. It is mentioned in verse number 18. It is mentioned in verse number 21. It is mentioned in verse number 23. It is mentioned in verse number 28. It is mentioned in verse number 30. It is mentioned in verse number 32. It is mentioned in verse number 34. It is mentioned in verse number 36. It is mentioned in verse number 38. It is mentioned in verse number 40. It is mentioned in verse number 42. It is mentioned in verse number 45. It is mentioned in verse number 47. It is mentioned in verse number 49. It is mentioned in verse number 51. It is mentioned in verse number 53. It is mentioned in verse number 59. It is mentioned in verse number 57. It is mentioned in verse number 59. It is mentioned in verse number 67. It is mentioned in verse number 63. It is mentioned in verse number 65. It is mentioned in verse number 67. It is mentioned in verse number 69. It is mentioned in verse number 71. It is mentioned in verse number 72, 73. It is mentioned in verse number 75. It is mentioned in verse number 77 that فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ, that which of the favors of thy Lord will you deny? وَآخِرُ دَعْوَانَا الْحَمْدُلِلَّهِ رَبِّلْ عَالَمِينَ. Thank you. In the name of